Hi, Gordon Miller from G3. Again, thank you for joining me. So, on this election eve, I thought I'd do one video on the politics of this election. And I'm not going to get into who to vote for. That's not what kind of video this is. What I wanted to do is talk about the perception versus the reality on the election cycle and how this election's different than the last, 10 election cycles that I've been aware of since I was, probably in middle school and we started tracking such things. But, the first president I remember being elected is Reagan. I also remember Richard Nixon being president. I was born in '64 after Kennedy was assassinated, and Lyndon Baines Johnson was president at that time. I don't remember LBJ being in office. I remember my father watching footage of the first televised war that was brought to you during prime time, which is the Vietnam War, and so the footage was really amazing that they were able to bring back from the field. I remember that vividly, just like the moon landing and all the other stuff in the late 60s. But I do remember Jimmy Carter being president because my father was in the had service stations that he owned. He was in the oil and gas business, and we were there part of the odd even rationing days in '75 and '76. Where the OPEC people took over and gas was scarce and we had gas lines and things like that. So I remember those days, but the first presidential election cycle that I remember is the one for Reagan. And so where I really paid attention to the election. I mean, there was so much pain in the late 70s that was caused by Jimmy Carter and the OPEC problems and the Iran hostage deal and everything else that was happening back then. And so Richard Nixon and then Ronald Reagan were the ones that I remember the most. Ford and Nixon, in there for sure. But it's something that I remember the conventions and I remember those kind of things. But really the first one that I really participated in and really kind of felt a part of was the one for Reagan. I would have been 16 at the time, too young to vote, but it was an election that I was interested in and I followed. Reagan did very well. He was very well liked by the whole country, and I think that similar type of mentality seems to exist in this one for Donald Trump. I think there's an enormous number of people that have come out at the rallies and been there, and those people that show up 10, 20, 30,000 at a time to be at a rally, those people are going to be there on election day tomorrow. And so they already have done early voting in some places, and it looks like in some places they're looking at voter turnout being between 50% and 100% higher than normal in a given year. So we're going to set records for this election year in terms of votes, I predict. And I think there is, a lot of supporters for Hillary Clinton. I think that, certainly the tactics employed in this election cycle, have been brutal on both sides, and the conversation has gotten very divisive. I know I just lost a friend on the other side on Facebook who I think has just unfriended me based on his message that he just sent me. So, hey, I'm sorry about that. It's one of those things that no matter who's president, we'll wake up on Wednesday morning, which is actually my birthday, and we'll have a new president or a new president-elect. And whoever the president is, then we'll all get through this. The more important thing is that the country is still the best country in the world. I've had the pleasure of traveling all over the world, and I've enjoyed the fact that there's nothing like getting back to the United States. And I really think that the American people will fall into line with whatever the election results are. I don't think it's going to be the next civil war. I don't think it's going to be the end of the United States as we know it, regardless of who wins. Are there people stealing campaign signs? Sure. Yeah, of course there are. Yeah, but there's always been people stealing campaign signs. Are there people who are posting information that is half-truth and innuendo? Sure. There's always people posting half-truth and innuendo. YouTube wouldn't exist if there was, if people weren't posting half-truths and innuendo. The only difference this time is that the mainstream media seems to be hell-bent on posting information with a bias that we didn't used to have. If you look at news cycles 20, 30 years ago, you didn't have the same kind of bias that we see now, where they're telling the story from a particular perspective rather than giving you the facts and letting you make up your own mind. And so I think that's a huge difference. And I see that as leading to a lot of the discontent that's out there in this election cycle. So what do I think is going to happen, based on the polls? Well, I don't think polls are an accurate representation. It's funny, the ABC poll that people were complaining about not too long ago, were talking about the fact that only 29% of the people polled were Republicans, and Donald Trump lost by 14%. Well, I don't know about the rest of you, but if you poll, 100% of the people and only 29% are Republicans, and Trump only loses by 14%, that means that independents and some Democrats must be voting for Trump. And so I would have expected Trump to lose by 30% if it was fair, or at least by 20%. And so I think that we're going to find that the election is a lot closer than anybody thinks. Do I think it's going to be close enough to where Trump may win? I do. I think that there's a possibility that all the people who came out to the rallies, tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands, will show up on election day and send a message that that's the kind of America they want, that they want changes where we're not getting into debt anymore, and we're not expanding the size of government, we're not running up the cost of health care, and we're healing the country from a racial standpoint. I would have expected that after 8 years of the first African-American president, that racial relationships in this country would be better than ever. I would have hoped, that would have been my best hope for what this Obama presidency would have done. But unfortunately, relationships are worse than it's ever been. And largely it's because the sense of authority that has always been there about respect for the military and respect for the police, it just doesn't exist anymore. Police officers are being shot randomly across the country, from Iowa to Texas to Louisiana to Missouri to, all over the place. And it's just got to stop. I mean, we have to have a society of rules. Now, are there people who have been shot by officers either by mistake or prematurely? Sure, it happens. It's a dangerous job. Should they be taking more precautions? Probably. And is it difficult for African American men in a police stop situation? I'm sure it's incredibly tense, and I know that there's a lot of work that needs to be done there, and I hope we get the opportunity to try and solve those problems. But the one thing I know is that this country and its people at its core have a big heart. There's a lot of value that we have here. And when we stop and focus on what really matters, and the fact that we're all in this together, regardless of our political ideologies, that we're all going to row the lifeboat in the same direction. We're all in this boat together. So, we may not like who's rowing the boat at the moment, and we can vote to change that. But so much depends on this election. I predict that if Hillary Clinton wins, whether or not she finishes out 8 years of 2 terms or not is immaterial. There will be, just like there was a Clinton gun ban previously under Bill Clinton, I believe we'll see assault weapons being banned again. I think that's one of the things that Tim Kaine is providing the ticket with the opportunity to do that. It's an objective that he's very fond of. I think we'll see the curtailment of concealed weapon permit rights. I think we'll see a more liberal bent to the Supreme Court, which will likely continue to affect our society for a long time to come. And I think government will continue to increase. I think we'll end up with a single-payer healthcare system that's nationwide. This state-based system is terribly broken. We should be offering healthcare across state lines. Competition should be ruling the day. It shouldn't be a single-payer system, but that's what we're likely going to end up with, which will be grossly inefficient, just the way Medicare is grossly inefficient right now. I think we could bring down the cost of healthcare by 50% just by making it competitive and having an actual open market for healthcare. And that's one of the things that Trump is calling for. I think that we have way too much debt, and everybody talks about the deficit getting smaller. We're still overspending. So, I had said a long time ago that, we got about 20 trillion in debt. We need to spend $1 trillion a year less than what we bring in. Well, the United States brings in about 5.6 trillion a year, and or the budget's 5.6 and we bring in 3 point something, I forget. But we need to figure out how much we're going to bring in taxes. I had said a long time ago, one of the ways to solve the current debt crisis for the United States is to spend $1 trillion a year less than what we take in, and put that $1 trillion a year towards the debt. And then after 20 years, it would be entirely paid off. The United States has to get to a point where its debt is paid off if we want to be able to build the type of economic prosperity that we can do in the long term. Before you know it, 100% of our budget every year will be on entitlement services, Social Security, and on debt payments, with no money for the military or any other kind of infrastructure or anything else in the United States. And we're not going to significantly increase the amount of money that we bring in. They have to stop overspending. We've overspent from $8 trillion in deficit in 2008 to now almost $22 trillion by the time Obama leaves office. So we're talking about the largest single increase in debt the United States has ever seen. You can't do that forever and expect that there's not going to be consequences. So when you go to the polls tomorrow, I encourage you to vote for whichever candidate you feel is going to give you the type of America that you're looking for. And unfortunately, there's not enough economic discipline on the Democratic side. Everybody talks about how if Trump gets elected, it'll be the worst thing in the world for the stock market. Well, that's because Trump will significantly curtail the growth of government jobs and will seriously curtail the amount of government spending, which is in government contracts. And those will have an impact on those businesses. But it's still an important thing to do for the country. We can't continue to overspend. By the time Hillary Clinton leaves office after 2 terms, if it grows in the same rate that the Obama administration has done, we'll have almost $40 trillion in debt. The debt payment alone will take up most of our available budget. So it's a very difficult process to be in. So email issues aside and scandals aside and everything else aside, the only thing that matters is if you are interested in a right to keep and bear arms, there's only one candidate. If you are interested in the U.S. becoming debt-free and learning to live within its means, then there's only one candidate to choose. And if you are concerned about the future of the Supreme Court and how that will affect rules and everything in our society, then, all of that clearly determines your choice. So you may not like what Donald Trump says, you may not like some of the things he stands for, but he still is offering a vision of America that will get all of the spending under control and hold Congress accountable for what they do spend. I think it'll be a good thing for America. We'll see. Thank you for joining me.